Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our August 3rd, A Garden in Every Season tour. Given the difficulties we've had with live streaming recently, especially with the decreased cell signal, we figured we would preemptively film this. But if you are watching at 11:30 on Monday, I should be there in the comments saying hello and getting ready to answer any questions that you might have. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Paige Engelbrechtson, and I am the Nature Center Education Specialist for the Highlands Botanical Foundation. And I created these monthly tours to highlight what's new and changing in our garden. And as you can see from our Nature Center pollinator garden, there are certainly a plethora of things that we could talk about. The Turk's cap lily, which is the tall orange lily you're seeing there. The Joe Pye weed, which is just getting ready to bloom with its pink flowers. Or even the sunflowers here, which seems like not too long ago they were at waist height. But I've also been noticing something else really cool changing here in the garden. And it's neat because it circles back to many of the plants that we've done past tours on, because it's kind of the opposite side of a flower's life cycle. So we are going to be talking today about fruits. And we're going to stop by and basically meet some old friends, folks that we've seen on previous tours. If you haven't seen any of our previous garden tours or videos, don't fret. We'll definitely go through a rundown of how to identify them, a little bit of background on why they are what they are, and then talk about their fruits, because it's a new area for me to look into this summer as I've been paying attention really closely to a lot of these plants. So if you have any questions or comments, shout them out, and we're going to get started. So the first plant that I want to focus on is this one right here. If you have any guesses, throw them up in the chat. But I'll tell you, when I look at this plant, I notice the long stem and how it arches. I also look at the alternating leaves, meaning that they're not paired together, they happen one after another, that they're also quite broad and veined. And finally, one of the benefits of doing this after it's flowered is I see where the fruits are, which is usually where the flowers have been. So it told me that the flowers were hanging down underneath this long stem. And that all together says to me Solomon's seal, which is named after actually the rhizome, or the root-like structure buried in the ground. If you said false Solomon's seal or Solomon's plume, you would be close. They are quite similar, at least in terms of their leaf arrangement and the overall shape. But Solomon's plume has all the flowers together at the very end of the stem, and that's where we would find berries as well. And were they ripe, they would be bright red. In contrast, take a look at these. They're a little greenish, but they remind me very much of giant blueberries, which is an interesting idea. And when I've been noticing the fruits around the garden, one of the questions I ask is, what disperser eats these? Because what the plant wants, if we were to give it human-like thoughts and emotions, is for these seeds to be consumed along with the fruit, and then for the disperser animal to take it elsewhere and deposit it in what is hopefully a favorable habitat, so those seeds can germinate and become new plants. And the way that the fruit is arranged, or the color of the fruit, can be good clues about who the plant is targeting, what kind of dispersers the plant would like to eat its fruit. And so one of the things I like to do is I like to look from above and think, do the fruits stand out? Can I see them if, for example, I was a bird sitting up in one of the trees around here? And when I look at the Solomon seal, I don't see those dark berries. They are hidden by the foliage. So my next thought was, okay, it's probably not birds. What about small mammals? Because if you've ever sat here long enough, you will certainly have seen a number of chipmunks scurrying hither, thither, and yonder. There's also other relatively small or medium-sized animals, like raccoons, that might come along and eat this. And I started digging into it and reading up on it. And you can imagine, I was pretty shocked when people kept saying that birds were good dispersers of the seeds, that the birds were the ones eating these fruits. But the birds that I was thinking of wouldn't see it. And then I came across a reference that clicked for me, which was robins. So picture a robin. It could be sitting up in the cherry tree right next to the nature center, and I've seen plenty of them do that. But it is just as likely to be down in our amphitheater hopping around on the grass. They are foraging on the ground. So if this Solomon seal was growing on the forest edge where robins might be hopping by, and the robin is hopping along on the ground and looks up, it's going to see this berry in a dark color, a large shape, contrasted with that pale foliage. That's going to be a good visual clue to the robin. So it might flutter up, grab a berry, eat it, fly off, and hopefully drop the seeds somewhere suitable. Other ground foraging birds include thrushes like eastern towhees or veeries. So we have a lot of options, including even ruffed grouse, which I don't think of very often around here, but do live on the plateau. So they would all enjoy a lovely snack if they were to eat these, but we would not. And that's because as much as these might look like blueberries, they are poisonous for people. Apparently symptoms of toxicity include vomiting and diarrhea, which does not sound like a fun day for anybody. Which raises perhaps the biggest point for me about fruits here in Southern Appalachians. You may be familiar with the fact that we have rampant blackberries and raspberries and even blueberries growing wild, but not every fruit you see is going to be edible, and you should always be 100% sure that what you are picking is, first of all, edible, and from the plant you think you're grabbing it off of. And I'll show you an example of why. Because over here in this stonework, these are blueberry bushes. You are probably very familiar with its cultivated variety, but there are wild blueberries here on the plateau. I can neither confirm nor deny how tasty these are. But you'll see that same kind of dark coloration. It's a good flagging telling the animals that might eat it, hey, I'm ripe, I'm tasty, I'm full of sugar, come eat me. And they can get quite dark. There's one right there. It says, I'm really ripe, come and eat me. And so if I were to see this shrub growing perhaps up on a granitic dome on a hike to Panther Town, and I'm reaching in there and I'm stripping off little blueberries and saying, yum, 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 and I reach in and I grab one of these, I'm in for a bad day because this isn't a blueberry. It's part of a Solomon seal. So if you're thinking about edible versus non-edible and ever eating anything from the forest, know exactly what it is you're eating, know that it is in fact edible, and be really sure you're grabbing it from the right plant. For those of you who may be asking how I know it's a blueberry, I actually had to sit down and kind of break down my thought process. Having blueberry bushes in my yard means I'm very familiar with the overall look of it, but the stems are kind of zigzaggy. They don't grow in a straight line. They're also kind of knobbly from the old twigs. The growth is happening at the end of those twigs. And the twigs are kind of this reddish color, but they can also be fairly green as well. It's just kind of like a delicate, kind of spindly look to the shrub. And of course, the biggest giveaway for me is the actual blueberries themselves. So those are two kinds of fruits that we've had out here in the botanical garden, and we're going to go see a couple more. So for those of you who are familiar with the botanical garden, you may know this as Woodland Way. And back in the spring, it was one of the first places that our spring ephemeral plants started blooming. Right now, there are very few things left blooming in this particular patch. It's a lot of greenery, a lot of foliage, which is absolutely beautiful. And I'm actually going to pop off trail here just to show you guys. This is a Solomon's plume. It's been chomped on by the deer a little bit, but they've missed the berries, which are not quite ripe because they're not that bright red. So you can see how it could be confused for a Solomon's seal, especially early on in the spring. But I wanted to revisit another one of our spring plants over here. I'm going to step up here. I want to point out this plant. Don't worry, we'll get to this little guy. But I want to start with this plant. Any ideas? When I look at it, I notice it's got a really thick stem that's split into two parts, and it has 3 leaves. It's not poison ivy because the leaves are very long and slender and tapering, and most importantly to me, they make a T shape. These are opposite each other with one down the middle. The leaves are not equidistant or equally spaced around the stem. This is a dead giveaway to me, no matter the size. This is a Jack in the Pulpit. Actually, this should be called a Jill in the Pulpit because it has the fruit, which means this spring, this plant produced a female flower because it has the fruits and seeds. If it were a male flower, the flower portion would have long since withered away and there would be no fruit on the plant itself. And thinking about that fruit, does it look like it's ripe? If you were coming across this in the woods, would you think, that would be a good snack? Well, I would not, because I like to think of our grocery stores and what kinds of fruits we eat when they're green and which kinds of fruits we wait a little while longer. Granny Smiths perhaps are one, and limes, to be fair, are fruits that are considered ripe when they're green. But other fruits we will typically wait on for them to ripen. So apples, most apples, oranges even, mangoes. When they're green, we know they're not going to be sweet. They're going to be hard. They're not at their most ripe. And the same is true with most of the fruits that we're going to see here in the garden. Green, if we're looking down from above, like we were with the Solomon seal, that blends in pretty well. That is not a sign that says, hey, come eat me. That's a sign that actually says, I'm not ready yet. I'm still hard. I haven't pumped a bunch of nutritious and delicious sugars in here. My seeds aren't mature. This is not the time to eat me. When this fruit does ripen, however, it will be a bright crimson red. So you can imagine, if we go back up again, and this is bright red. Think about how well that's going to stand out against all this green foliage, especially if you happen to be up high, like a bird. So in this case, the fruit is actively displayed in the open for the dispersers to come and eat. And that tells me it's probably birds that are going to see those red berries, swoop in and chomp away. And then, as the plant hopes, fly off and disperse those seeds, hopefully somewhere else in the botanical garden that's a suitable space for them. The interesting part when I was reading up on this, though, is birds don't seem to have an issue eating this when it's ripe. But if you were to eat pretty much any part of a Jack in the Pulpit, you would have a bad day. I'll give you 3 guesses as to why that is, and the first 2 don't count. Jack in the Pulpit is full of, I've got to remember this right, calcium oxalate, which is a fancy name, but importantly, it refers to kind of like a needle-like crystal, sharp and pointy, and it's all throughout this plant, including in the fruit. So if you were to eat Jack in the Pulpit, those crystals would go in and start damaging your tissues. So you're gonna have a really bad day if you eat the fruit or if you eat the rest of the plant, as far as my reading was able to uncover. So yeah, don't eat this even if it looks tempting. That's not what you want, how you want to spend your days. Hopefully I'll be able to put up a picture on Facebook with Winter's help if we get a good shot of one when it does get ripe. But I want to switch back and take a look at that flower that I pointed out earlier, which is this little guy right here. So this tall spike is connected to wee bitty baby rosettes, a small circle of very small leaves. And you may have noticed these leaves kind of scattered throughout the forest floor as you're hiking. They're kind of inconspicuous until they pop up with these really tall flowers. And if you know it, you may know it by a couple of different common names. When you put them all together, you can say it's called downy rattlesnake plantain, which is a really big name for what's a relatively small plant. Now, the downy portion comes from these teeny tiny white hairs that cover the stem and even the flowers themselves. And the plantain comes from, I would imagine, the fact that these rosettes look like the plantain that grows in your yard. But the rattlesnake portion really depends on who you're asking. So, some people say that the leaves remind them of the skin of a rattlesnake. That's how it gets its name. Some people say that historically this was used as a medicine to treat rattlesnake bites. That's where it gets its name. But other people will say, well, look at the flowers. What do the flowers remind you of? Kind of like a rattlesnake's rattle. And we actually have a preserved one right here. So you can kind of see the resemblance. Although, to be fair, this is a form that many flowers in our garden tend to take. So it's not exclusive just to the rattlesnake plantain. But regardless of how it gets its name, it's a very big name for a very small plant that has very small seeds. And this is how I'm tying it into kind of the fruit seed dispersal theme, because this plant is an orchid. And that alone tells me what its most likely mechanism for seed dispersal is. Because orchids are notorious for saying, well, rather than putting in all the time and energy, and it takes a lot of energy to make that huge fruit and wait for it to ripen, and hope an animal eats it, and hope the seed lands somewhere that's suitable for growing, I am going to make the smallest little seed possible. I'm going to make a minimalist seed and strip it of almost everything that it needs to germinate and disperse it by the millions on the wind. Because it's going to be so light, the wind can just pick it up and carry it away. So that's one option. It does mean that orchids don't germinate very readily because they don't have a lot of energy. They don't have that ready to go boost when they land. So they actually have to form a special relationship with a fungus to successfully germinate. But that is an entire other topic. So yeah, a cute little plant with tiny little seeds and a great big old name. And that is downy rattlesnake plantain. So we've seen a couple of different kinds of fruits, talked about a couple of different dispersal mechanisms. We've got birds for the Solomon seal, birds for the Jack in the Pulpit, people for the blueberry bush. But I bet you can also name a couple of other animals that would be attracted to blueberry bushes. I know personally, shout them out in the comments what you've seen around blueberry bushes, especially if you have them. Turkeys love my blueberry bushes, especially the ones that have fallen, and the birds tend to come in and take a bite out of them. So half the blueberries I pull off are already pre-nibbled, so to speak. But deer and bear and almost any other animal that can get its hands on those little berries certainly will. I wanted to stop and take a moment to show you guys the new homeowners demonstration garden that our botanical garden volunteers have been hard at work putting together. It is absolutely gorgeous, and every time that I come by, there's new improvements and new things that they've been tweaking. But if you haven't had a chance to come by the botanical garden in the last month, most of this is going to be new to you. So please give a shout out in the comments to our volunteers who've been hard at work making this happen, along with Mike McMahon, our facilities supervisor, who created basically the whole foundation for all of this. It is fantastic and it's beautiful, and I hope that you guys get a chance to see this in person if you haven't already. All right, folks, sorry about that transition. But the next plant that I wanted to cover is another one that we saw way back in the spring, and it is the one with these huge leaves. One of the really key characteristics is how deeply lobed they are. I saw somebody refer to them as duck's foot as a common name, which would be appropriate. But the common name that you may know it by actually comes from the fruit and the flower. So the flower will be nestled in between a plant that has two leaves coming off of one stem. And it'll be big and white, and it will bloom in the spring, which in some places may be May. And the fruit, if you get down underneath the kind of tattered leaves and take a look, resembles a fruit that we commonly eat. So there are some people who call this May apple. In fact, that's the most common name for it, but I found a few others while I was researching this that I think are also appropriate, because this fruit is not quite ripe. Much like the Jack in the Pulpit, where being green means it's not ready to be eaten yet, this will turn a lemon yellow color and be very wrinkled when it's fully ripe. Which gives it apparently another common name, wild lemon. And when it is ripe, who do you think the plant wants to take it away? What animal disperses these seeds that are inside here? I've got some actually that I found. See just the size of them, and it's a pretty substantial fruit. Even the most ambitious turkey would have an issue, I think, taking this off. It is hidden from above, and its size probably eliminates most birds. There's one other dead giveaway for me, which is I found this bit that's almost ripe, not quite wrinkly, but close to it. And it has a very pleasant smell, kind of like papaya. So it's going to be brightly colored, but it's going to be close to the ground. It's quite large, and it's got an odor to it. When I put those things together, that tells me it's probably mammals that disperse these seeds. And in fact, it's pretty much mammals. So anything from squirrels, which may have been what started gnawing on this particular piece here. Raccoons are another medium-sized mammal that has been known to eat this, and I found another common name suggested was raccoonberry, probably for just that reason. And I also saw that box turtles have been known to eat these in the past, so I'm going to keep an eye out and see if I can't find some to feed our box turtles here in the Nature Center. But you have to be careful, because when the fruit is unripe, like this, or if you were to eat the rest of the plant, you would have, you guessed it, a bad day. May apple actually is full of a toxin called podophyllin, which is a variant on Podophyllum, its genus. And it's not great if you eat the unripe fruit. However, people do eat the ripe fruit. I've seen that they make jellies and preserves out of them. But as with any kind of wild foraging, again, you really have to know what it is you're eating, when is the right time to pick it. I don't even know with its unwrinkled skin if this is ripe enough. What parts you should eat, and how much is safe to eat. If you have eaten May apple in the past, shout out in the comments. I'm really curious, but I feel like I need to do more research on it, just for myself to feel really comfortable chomping down on it if I can beat the chipmunks and squirrels and raccoons to any, either here in the garden or elsewhere. I did want to point out this one plant, just in passing, simply because of how striking its fruit is. Take a look at this. These red pink stems, the white fruit with those dark ends. They're said to resemble doll's eyes that you might use in porcelain dolls. And that's where it gets one of its common names. This is a plant that I struggle with identifying when it's not fruiting or flowering, in all honesty, but those fruits are a pretty good giveaway. However, think about who might be the target audience for these fruits. They're presented high above the foliage. They're very brightly colored when they're ripe. You can see the unripe fruits are very green, and the stems, while a little pink, are certainly not that vivid color. To me, I start to lean towards this is probably meant for birds to eat. And if you were thinking along those lines, congratulations, we're right. Which is really cool, because if you or I were to try and eat any part of this, we would have, you guessed it, a bad day. The other common name for this plant is white bain berry. So right away I suggest it's not something you should consume. I couldn't find a definitive read on what exactly the toxin involved was. It seems like nobody is quite sure. But again, it's one of these interesting cases with the Solomon's plumes and the Jack in the pulpits, where birds are capable of eating fruits and plants that are very detrimental for us mammals. And I didn't get a chance to dig into why that was, but if you know, please let me know, because it sounds like it's absolutely fascinating. Probably a couple different reasons for that, but all right. So we're coming here through the last part of our tour, which is running a little long, so thank you guys if you stuck all the way through with me. Thanks as well to the mosquitoes that are also sticking through with me. And the last plant that I want to highlight is here. Underneath the dog hobble and the bee balm and the yellow root, we have these guys. Now back in the spring, before the yellow root came back up and leafed, before the mints were going nuts, these were some of our earliest spring flowers. Now compare this to the Jack in the Pulpit, which had a T-shaped slender leaves. These leaves are quite broad. The shape is pretty characteristic of this group, and they're spaced equidistant around the stem. This is a trillium, and we have a number of different species here in Highlands, let alone the Southern Appalachians as a whole. And I will be honest, I looked through my photos. I suspect this is a red trillium, which threw me off because the size of the leaves is more suited to grandiflora, the biggest trillium that we have. But I remember it was odd because the flowers had a red center. I can double check my records. If anybody else has a guess, shout out. But I want to focus on the fruit. So just as a glance, they're dark colored, they're very conspicuous, they're presented above the foliage, but they're pretty firmly attached. So if it is intended for birds, maybe it's not quite right because it's so hard to pull off without a lot of effort. Well, that's definitely a good line of thinking, especially given everything else that we've seen today. But it's actually this trillium down here, which is kind of ducking underneath the yellow root, that's giving a clue as to what the actual disperser for these seeds are. The bowing down, I was reading, is apparently intentional. As the seeds are ripening, this very tough capsule is going to not only harden but also dry out. And there's not a lot of pulp inside. It's a very firm fruit. And that tells me there's probably a lot of seeds tucked in there. So you can imagine as this starts to bend down, it gets very close to the ground, and as it dries out, this skin is going to rupture. It's going to crack. This guy is doing, I think, maybe something else. I think something came and nibbled on it. But you can see inside those white dots, that's a seed. And those are going to be readily available close to or on the ground when they're ripe. And if I were to break one of these open, you would see those seeds that we saw that had been nibbled on. It's not just individual seeds, it's seeds with that kind of a packet attached to them. So you've got the seed, and then wrapped around it, you've got a really fatty bit of nutritious pulp called an elaiosome. And that is really good, a very good meal. Thank you, mosquitoes. I'm a meal for the mosquitoes, but the elaiosomes on the trilliums are a meal for another kind of creature entirely, one that crawls on the ground and that would take a little bit of effort but is fully capable of dragging that seed back to its colony. Trilliums rely on ants to disperse their seeds. So the idea is the seed might be available down on the ground, an ant will come and find it, drag it back to its colony, bring it down into the earth, and then it'll strip off the elaiosome, that really tasty food bit, and it'll chuck the seed into essentially what's a compost pile, the garbage heap of the colony, and leave the seed alone, which is exactly what the trillium want, because that is the perfect kind of condition for them to germinate in. So this is not a great example, but I'm sure if you've been hiking around here enough, you have seen whole hillsides that are absolutely covered with trillium. And that's a really good sign that there are a lot of ants there that are more than happy to take those seeds and provide them unintentionally with the right growing conditions. So we've seen fruits that are dispersed by birds, by mammals and box turtles, by the wind, and now by ants. So as many kinds of animals as can disperse seeds, are plants that are trying to entice them to do so. And that is the end of our tour. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know. I certainly have ones that I have come to and have been raised as my research into this has gone on. But that, I think, about does it. Give you guys a shot of what this section is looking like. Tonight we are posting the final Yoga in the Garden video, thanks to Yoga Highlands and Rachel Kinback. If you liked it, please let us know. We had different plans for it this summer, but we were glad we were able to adapt it to be virtual. And speaking of virtual programs, we're also going to start a short virtual Zahner series, August 13th. It'll be abbreviated both in length and in the number of lectures that we're going to have, but details will be available through our newsletter, our website, and Facebook if you're interested in joining us for some really cool speakers. Trying to adapt and carry on that tradition as well this year. I think that about does it. Thank you guys for bearing with me and for being here. And I hope that wherever you are staying safe, you are staying happy. And if you have a chance to come visit the Botanical Garden, please do. It remains open and free to the public year-round, dawn to dusk. And maybe one day I'll be able to see you guys at the Nature Center too. All right, folks. Take care.